Thank you very much for organizing this, and well, I'm quite impressed. I am not used to have so many students. In Kingston, it's more around 8-10 students, so I'll try to be as interactive as with these guys, but it's going to be a bit more complicated. One more thing, I'm not a professor, I'm an associate professor, so thank you very much, but maybe in 5 years. All right, so what I'll try to do today is try to convince you that you should use Post-Keynesian Stock-Flow consistent modeling, may it be the aggregate version or the the agent-based version of it. And when I think about it, the first thing is, well, obviously the Post-Keynesian Stock-Flow consistent modeling highlights fundamental real financial interactions. I think Tom did a very good job this morning of trying to show you that the finance was very important and that you need to take into account the financial world when you want to look at what happens in the real world as well. The second thing is, I think it's a very powerful detector tool. As Sebastian was telling you, I was trained as an engineer at first, and my approach to economics has always been that I do models to understand what's going on, not for the purpose of the model, but because while building the model, you actually see things you wouldn't directly see. So I think the process of building the model makes the model useless at the end because you've understood what you want trying to do. But still, I think it's a very important process, and so building models helps you understanding better what you're looking at. And finally, there's a strong empirical connection between Stock-Flow consistent modeling and the national accounts, and so it's fairly easy, and I'm putting a lot of quotes around fairly to bring these models to the data. And finally, I didn't put there, but it's really fun to do. So I'm having lots of fun. I hope you guys will have lots of fun doing SFC modeling afterwards. All right, so just to start, I won't do the insult to tell you what is this and how you get from the GDP to the sectoral imbalances. But so what you have here is that by doing a bit of mathematics, you end up from the GDP definition to another definition, which is always true, which is accounting identity, where you see that basically Y minus T minus C minus I is basically the savings from the private sector. So it's all the income that the private sector, households, firms, non-financial corporations, financial corporations have as an income, and then all the expenditure, the taxes they pay, the consumption they do, and the investment they do. This gives you this net savings from the private sector. Then you have T minus G, which is the net savings from the government. Taxes are the income from the government, and G is their expenditure. And then you have M minus X, which is the net savings from the rest of the world. Imports are the income from the rest of the world, and exports are the expenditure. So what you see here is, again, it's an accounting. There is no causality here. It's just, this is always true no matter what. You see that the savings from these three sectors are always equal to 0. Why is this important? Well, because the net lending position is fundamental to try to understand the dynamics of the balance sheets. So by looking at this lending position, you understand the imbalances that are building up in the economy. And as Still will show you this afternoon, you will see that imbalances are fundamental to understand the dynamics of the world in which we live. So by looking at this net lending position, and you can actually afterwards divide the net lending position of the private sector between households, financial corporations, and non-financial corporations, by looking at this net lending position, you actually are observing imbalances as they grow up. So just let's look at the UK. What you see, for example, is that the Tony Blair government in the 1990s, 2000s, when the government had a surplus. So the purple line there, see there were this saving for most of the time, but when Tony Blair was in power. You actually see also that the rest of the world is always net saving, meaning that the UK has been had a trade imbalance for most of the time. What is worrisome is when you look at the green line and you see that the households have been dissaving for a long period of time. And that's very problematic. The households usually are net savers. When you read any macro book, you always have, well, households are net savers and the rest of the economy is net borrowing. In this case here in the UK, but it's true in the US as well, and in most of European countries, you have a net dis-saving from the households. What happens when the balance sheets of the households are going down, where they are losing net worth as we speak? Well, that's very important. That explains why at some point, well, you have a debt crisis. The households are not anymore able to sustain their debt, or the level of wealth is going down. So you understand here why looking at it in a position gives you already a hint of where you should look at things. Obviously, again, as I said, there is no causality, so you won't be able to say, well, what's causing what, but still, it gives you a nice indicators where you should look at things, what is going on in the economy. And then you can take this and look at the data and try to understand what is causing the net lending position. So the first thing we'll do is we'll look at household income. This is for the EU economy as a whole. And you can look at the flow of funds. And this is coming from the ECB, but you have Eurostat is providing all this data. So what you have is first you look at income. So you have all the source of income for the households. That's 7 billion euros. Then you look at the net social contribution that they receive from the government, 182 millions. 108 billions. And then you have taxation, minus 962 billions, and you obtain the gross disposable income from the households. Okay? Next, what you look at their consumption, the expenditure. You look, basically, they consume 5.5 thousand trillions of euros. And you obtain the gross savings. But that's not finished, because what happens next is very important to understand the net lending position. It's the transfers between the different sectors. So what you don't see in the GDP is actually what's going on between sectors. The transfer from households to banks, from banks to financial corporation, and so on and so forth. So what you obtain here is, well, the consumption of fixed capital, the capital transfer, and the change in net worth. So when you have all these transfers happening, then you see what is the net saving of the household sector, 229. So you see here, you see that the number here, which we were looking at before, actually is composed of lots of different sub-flows, if you want, income, consumption, transfer, taxes, and so on and so forth. So if you understand the dynamics of each of these flows, then you actually understand better the dynamics of the net saving position. That's one side of the story of the flow, the income flows, or the expenditure flows. But then the other side of the story is on the balance sheets. How does these net worth, net savings are being allocated between the different sources of assets and liabilities? So you can look at the balance sheet. And again, this is data from the Eurostat. And so you can look at the household financial statement, their balance sheet in 2012 Q4. And you see that basically they have non-financial assets, housing, and then you look at the financial assets, currency, securities, loans, shares and equities, insurance, pensions, and others. All right, so you have all the money they had at some point in 2012 Q4. Afterward, you can look at how did this change in the next quarter, or in the next year in this case. And you see that there is a different allocation of all these. And this gives you the change in stocks. So how did the allocation of net wealth, well, actually not net wealth, gross wealth and liabilities, so assets and liabilities, because you have loans here with a minus sign implying that they are actually owing money to someone else. And you see how these flows did change. And the sum of all this change gives you the same net lending position. So you see that the net lending position, which we looked at before, actually is composed of two components. There's an income flow, where you see all the income from the different sectors, but also how did they allocate the net savings into the different stocks of assets and liabilities. But why is this important? Why is this important? Well, here I'm going from the macro to the micro a bit, just to show you the importance of looking at balance. The analogy I usually do with my students is that you've seen matrix, right? And at some point, Neo sees the matrix. When you understand the balance sheets, you're like Neo. You understand what's going on in the economy. I haven't done the video. Anyway. So, okay. So let's take a very simple example. And maybe at the end, you'll all be Neos. So you have, this is a very simplistic economy where you have two agents. And they hold deposits to two banks, different banks. And these banks have holding reserves from the central bank. Very, very simplistic. There's much more than that, but just for the sake of the argument. And let's say that agent A wants to pay 10 to agent AB for anything. Maybe they bought bread or anything. It doesn't really matter. And it pays by doing a transfer from its deposits to the deposit account of agent AB. Well, if you look only at that, it looks like, well, the transfer of net wealth from agent AA to agent AB, fine. But also because deposits are a liability for the bank, there's also a change, for the moment, in net wealth for the banks, because bank BA has seen a decrease in its liabilities, and bank BB has seen an increase in liabilities. This is not the end of the story. The next part of the story is the clearing mechanism, by which there's a transfer in reserves from bank BA to bank BB. What you've seen now is that because there's a decision by agent AA to pay agent AB, the balance sheets of bank BA and BB have changed. They were fully passive. They didn't do anything about it. They didn't choose anything. But now they are going to have to react to that. Maybe their reserve requirement is not high enough. Maybe the balance sheet has been changed and they want to allocate in a different way the balance sheets. So now you see that because of some agents are active in the economy, other agents which are passive nonetheless decide to change and to do something about it. So you understand the sheer complexity of what's going on in the economy, of the balance sheets, movements, which are the results of the flow decisions of agents. Okay, this is really fundamental. When you understand its complexity, when you perceive that what we are actually in the end is a huge network of balance sheets which are all interrelated to each other, and that each decision we make at every point in time is going to have impacts on others' agents' balance sheets, then you understand the complexity of what we look at that. And this is fundamental. Obviously, then you can decide whether you think that what you want to analyze has to be analyzed at the micro level like this, or at the macro level, when you only use the stock-flow consistent, aggregate stock-flow consistent approach. Okay? But what I think this is probably one of the most important things. You want to be neo. You want to see the matrix operating. And then afterwards, you need to understand what is driving the behavioral equation, what is driving the flow and the allocation. And that's where the post-Keynesian theory, to my understanding, is bringing more interesting analysis than others' schools of thought. But nonetheless, you could try to do a micro-agent-based stock-flow consistent with neoclassical theory if you wanted to, right? So the idea is, okay, there's a structure of the economy, which is this network of balance sheets, but then you have to understand the behaviors that drives the evolution of this dynamic network of balance sheets. Okay? So what I'll do here is I'll now introduce briefly 2 or 3 papers which I believe have been very interesting in highlighting these imbalances, these movements of stocks and of flows in the economy to show the importance of this kind of analysis. The first one is obviously from Godley. Godley in 1999 wrote this brilliant piece called 7 Unsustainable Process. He basically was calling for the crisis to come way before any other one. Okay? So look, we are in 1999. Everything is doing brilliantly. Everyone is happy. Clinton is saying there are no limits to the world we can create together in the century to come. Really. No limits. Here we are. 7 years of crisis now. Okay? Something which the students I'm teaching now have not known the world without the crisis. Right? When you look at economic students in the beginning, they weren't going into economics because the crisis had become. No, they don't go there because there's novelty about the crisis. The crisis has always been there. They've always seen the crisis. Okay? All right. So Godley says, okay, well, there's a problem here. Now, he's calling for political intervention and basically expansionary fiscal policies. He's saying we need the government to intervene here and to make sure that the processes we are seeing are not unsustainable in the long run. We need the government to do something about it. And, sorry. So, what are these different processes? First of all is the fall in private savings into even deeper negative territory. We have seen that, right? We have seen in the UK in the 2000s the net savings, net de-savings from the households. The rise in the flow of net lending to the private sector. So the private sector, which usually is seen as the borrower, they are supposed these are the guys that's supposed to invest and take money from the savers. The private sector was actually net lending. The rise in the growth rate of real money stocks. So expansionary monetary policies. The rise in the asset price at the rate of that far exceeds the growth of profits. If the financial sector is having a growth rate which is higher than the real growth rate of the economy, there is going to be a problem. Because the value of the money, the value of the assets, is losing its connection with the real world. Remember that in the end, the value of the money you own only is interesting if you can buy things with it. If the financial world grows faster than the real world, it's bound to happen. At some point, you're going to have a problem. The rise in the budget surplus. It's not always a problem that the government is running a budget surplus, but if you do it for a long period of time, there is going to be a problem. The rise in the current account deficit and the increase in the United States for net foreign indebtedness of relative to GDP. So the fact that the US was actually being more and more dependent on the rest of the world. So what he does to perform his analysis, he looks at what we call stock-flow norms. The stock-flow norms is when you ask to any post-Keynesian stock-flow consistent modeler and you ask what is a stock-flow norm, you'll have some weird answers. There's no clear definition. But nonetheless, we can try to do that, which is the intrinsic dynamics that reflect the dynamic behavior, stemming from certain logical relationship with constraint in the system, specifically the relationship between stocks and flows. So to give you an idea, let's look at the adjusted fiscal ratio. So if you define theta as being the average tax rate, then the fiscal ratio, which is G over theta, is equal to GDP when government are running no deficit and no surplus. Okay? So you can look at how is G over theta moving and comparing it with the dynamics of GDP. If G over theta is above GDP for a long time, that means the government is running a deficit. If, on the other hand, G over theta is below GDP for a long time, the government is running a surplus. You can look at the adjusted tax rate ratio, trade ratio, where if you define mu as the average propensity to import, and you look at exports over this mu, again, it's equal to GDP when there is no trade imbalance. And you can look at the dynamics of this adjusted trade ratio with GDP. And then you can combine the two and have this combined fiscal and trade ratio, again, which is equal to GDP when there is balanced budget and trade balance. And you can look at the dynamics of these things and see, all right, so if you look at the adjusted fiscal ratio on the left, you see that it has been above GDP for quite a long period of time. But it reverted towards 2000s. That's when Godley was saying, okay, we see a change in dynamics here, and that's going to be a problem in the future. You can look at the adjusted trade ratio, and again, the trade ratio was actually diverging quite clearly from GDP. So when you see these divergence in terms of stock-flow norms with respect to GDP, or any other stock-flow norms, you have a hint that something is happening there and that you want to understand what's going on. These, again, are just indicators. They just merely reflect that something is happening and that you should investigate further down and try to understand what is driving these dynamics. So what Godley concluded was, if we don't change anything, it's not going to be sustainable, and we might be facing a crisis. Obviously, it's difficult to say when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. And so he advocates for a much larger government deficit or expenditure, which is about 16% higher to what the CBO was advocating. Much closer to now, my good friend Stephen Kinsella wrote this piece in a year ago. And so it was just when Ireland is getting better. And so everyone is saying, look, austerity is working. Ireland has gone out of the bailout program. Everything is fine. They're all happy and having more kids than ever. Is that true? Is Ireland actually getting better? Just to give you an idea, and I think this picture is really frightening. So it's an index of the index value of GDP, unemployment rate, and debt to GDP. This is when the crisis unraveled, and look at what unemployment does. Unemployment doubled in a year and a half, 2 years. I mean, literally, you have seen construction buildings stopping overnight. They didn't have the time to take off the crane. It stopped. the economy stopped. So, I mean, it's a pretty serious relationship, right? And I don't know how you can say that that level of unemployment is actually okay, right? So it stopped growing, fine, that's true. But it didn't go down. And right now, the numbers are not still overwhelming. Then you look at the sectoral balances. All right, so first of all, a note, the really spiky thing has to do with the way Statistics Ireland is treating data. So when they do quarterly data, there is a guy, let's call him Sean. And the guy says, I'll get data for quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3. And maybe Sean goes to his boss and says, listen, the data are strange. And the boss says, no worries. We'll fix it at the end. And that's what you have. The spikes there are the last quarter of the year. Basically, they just make it work. That's not funny. And then you have to work with this data. Good luck. Anyway, so what you see nonetheless is that you clearly see that the private sector and the rest of the world are somewhat going upwards, so saving, and the public sector is somewhat desaving. Okay. So you understand here that basically the reason why the government actually doesn't have to go too much into deficit is because the rest of the world is allowing it. What is going on then is that you look at the trade balance, so the trade surplus is here, and it's improving dramatically over during the crisis, and it's because exports have been increasing quite a lot, while imports have been stable. So what did austerity do? Austerity basically tamed down imports, and Ireland went out of the crisis because the UK and the US went out of the crisis. Not because austerity has made them more competitive. They are not trading with Europe mostly. They are trading with UK and the US, and the UK and the US went out of the crisis much before Europe. So Ireland is going out of the crisis, not because they have been implementing austerity and the government has been more efficient and so on and so forth, because they can actually trade themselves out of the crisis. So it's because Ireland is also a very financial open economy that the massive change in portfolio allocation from the financial assets happened without having impact to the households. So you have financial companies that changing their portfolio allocation, which made possible these kind of changes. So the reason why Ireland went out of the crisis was because they were able to improve their trade performance. Obviously, there's things to say about the fact that given that Ireland has had bankrupted 3 times in 50 years, the fact that they went out of the crisis, out of the bailout process is still remarkable and so on and so forth. And so you don't want to undermine their achievements, and they have been suffering quite a lot to achieve that. But it's just to say that you shouldn't take Ireland as the poster child for austerity. Finally, and this is coming from a work I'm doing with the Bank of England, and they have been analyzing, well, after the crisis happened, obviously everyone was coming to them and say, why did it happen? How come no one did anything about it? I mean, you're supposed to be the Bank of England, the central bank. You're supposed to know what's going on. Well, obviously, they had some issues with the modeling they were using. It's the first time when we do this program that they actually have the central bank in the model. It's the first time this is us. We are in there. We actually do something in there. And so what they were saying is that basically you need to have a longer term horizon when you do modeling, and you have to look at the balance sheet's evolution on the medium to long run, not only looking at the 2 years DSGE output saying, well, it's going to be 2.5% growth. You're fine. So you need to understand the building up of financial imbalances contributed and how it contributed to the Great Recession. So, and here they willingly admit that the DSGE models don't have much to say about financial balances. Any wealth to income ratio can be supported as an equilibrium, any debt to GDP, and so on and so forth. So it's basically what Mervyn King was saying, the dominant new Keynesian model of monetary economics lacks an account of financial intermediation so that money, credit, and banks play no meaningful role, which is kind of frightening. If you are the central bank and yet you think that money, credit, and banks play no role, you're not doing your job quite well. All right, so I hope I actually convince you that it's important to look at balances both in terms of flows and in terms of stocks. that a seemingly sound situation might hide imbalances, and that you actually have something building up on the long run which might be unsustainable, that you need to understand the financial side and the feedbacks between the real world and the financial world, and that you need for a dynamic model which shows path dependency. I haven't talked much about it, but the idea of path dependency is that the long run is composed of short run interactions. So it's the short run imbalance that actually create the long run imbalances. And you're not in an equilibrium where you go back. You don't have a shock which makes the economy go back to where it was. We are in a transition. And the transition depends on the speed at which you transit. Okay, so this is really fundamental as well. Sorry. Okay, so now let's go a bit more into the post-Keynesian Stock-Flow consistent. So we haven't invented anything, and looking at stock and flows has been done for a long time in economics. In a way, it's very much related to the idea of economics. Maurice Copeland in '49 was actually trying to do that, so he basically started doing national accounting. He said, okay, where are flows coming in, where are flows going out? And so, but for roughly 30 years, it wasn't much picked up. So for 30 years, the work of Copeland were somewhat unnoticed, and no one really thought that it was worth pursuing it. And then in the 1980s, James Tobin started his work mostly on portfolio allocation, and he arguably has the first complete Stock-Flow consistent model, where you have a matrix approach to accounting plus a closure in terms of modeling. And his Nobel lecture in 1982 is clearly part of a SFC manifesto. So he was arguing for the precision regarding time. So are we looking at quarters? Are we looking at year, month, and so on and so forth? The importance of tracking stocks. The need to have several assets and rate of returns for these different assets. The modeling of financial and monetary policies operation, and the usage of Walras laws of adding up constraints. But on the same time, while Tobin was developing his approach, Wynne Godley was also developing his own approach, and who probably did the most formalization work and development, and obviously wrote with Mark the Bible, the famously Godley in Lavoie 2007, among many others. And so I guess if you look at the historical there, we lie clearly on the shoulder of all these giants, but Wynne Godley did the most the most work on formalization and making it look like what we do today. But what is it? So the post-Keynesian SFC modeling approach basically offers a framework, an accounting framework, which allows you to trace stocks and flow, and the framework is complete, integrated, and coherent. So, and the reason why I say coherent is because not only do you need to have stock flow consistency, making sure that all the stocks are the composition of evolution of flow, but also that the time series you're looking at are coherent with each other. Again, a very simple example, at the Bank of England, when they calibrate their DSGE model, they're using a time series for government expenditure, a series for taxation, and a series for deficit. While if you do G minus T, you don't get deficit. Why they do so? Well, because it's better for the calibration process. That's a lack of coherence, not consistency, because the model, the DSGE, is probably consistent. Well, they don't have much stocks, but anyway. But so it's consistent, but it's not coherent. So what you want to do when you do a modeling approach is you want rigor, you want consistency, and you want coherence in everything you do. And so because you have this framework, then you can ask these questions. What form does personal saving take? Where does any excess of sectoral income actually go to? Who is providing the counterparty to every transaction in assets? Why are budget deficits so important? And so on and so forth. So you actually have a complete vision of the world. You have no black box, and you understand the dynamics of all the relevant stocks and flows. More formally, we actually have two parts: accounting and behavioral equations. So the accounting part. Well, the first important part is rules. So you want to have consistency between stocks and flows, and between stocks and flows. Sorry, among stocks and flows, and between stocks and flows. So someone's asset is someone else's liability, and someone inflow is someone else's outflow. So it's a quadruple entry system of Copeland. So you want to make sure that every flow has an origin and a destination, and that every asset in the economy has a liability holder and an asset holder. And then obviously, because of the accounting rules, you have to make sure that the budget constraint for each individual sector is respected, and obviously as a whole for the economy. So the idea of Walras law and Adidas constraints of Tobin 1992 are the budget constraints and system-wide consistency requirement of Godley in Law 2007. And so to support this accounting framework, what you have is we're going to have three different matrices. An aggregate balance sheet for the economy, the transaction flow, which shows all the flows in the economy, and the flow of funds, which show how, from the net lending position, do you update the balance sheets? How the savings or the savings of each sector is going to be allocated between the different stocks in the economy. Let's just go into details. So, for example, this could be a balance sheet. You might have that the households are holding bank deposits, and these are an asset for the households, and obviously there will be a liability for the banks. So that's why you have a minus CA. Maybe firms are borrowing from banks, so you have a minus L for the liabilities of firms and a plus L for the assets of banks. And then, importantly, you see that capital, real capital, the thing that produces stuff, is an asset for the firms, but has no liability counterpart. So the net worth of the economy is equal to the real capital stock. Okay? So you see that there is no net wealth out of bank deposits, no net wealth out of loans, but a net wealth out of capital stock. And then you can look at by sector and sum all the assets and liabilities and obtain the net worth for each sector. And if you sum all of these, so the net worth of the households, the net worth of the firms, the net worth of the banks, and of the government, this net worth has to be equal to the capital stock of the economy. Okay? And by the way, that's where maybe Piketty has been making a mistakes, because he only looks at firms and banks. He doesn't look at what's going on here. So he might be losing the fact that the real capital is actually net worth of the economy. But we can go into details afterwards if you want. All right, so then you can look at the flow dimension of the economy. So you can see that, for example, households consume, and again, if you sum the expenditure by households and the income by firms, you obtain 0. You can look at the investment, and so firms are, if you have a fully integrated firm sector, they're investing from themselves, so they're buying from themselves the capital. So you have a current account, a current income expenditure, a current income for the firms and a current capital expenditure for the firms. They sum up to 0. The wages are being paid by the firms to the households. Interest are being paid by firms to banks. Banks are paying interest to households. And then you might have some deposits. And in the end, again, so all of these flows sum up to 0. And you can look at the sum of all the expenditure and the income by sector and obtain the savings. So you have the savings from the households, the return earnings from the firms, the savings by the banks, and the savings from the government. What you see here is that when you divide between the current income and the capital income, you see that the return earnings are savings for the firm, but also that the investment here is an expenditure for the firms. Then you need to understand, from these saving position, how do you get to the change in balance sheets? And so you start again, and you have the savings from the firms, from the household, sorry, and these maybe lead to an increase in current account. And so that's how you end up with 0. So all the savings are being allocated to the deposit. For the firms, maybe you have that their return earnings and the sum of the increase in loans are equal to the investment, and so no net savings in the end. Banks, the same, and government. And so basically what you see is that you can allocate the whole savings of the economy across the different assets. All right, so what you see is that this is only a framework. You're only making sure that the accounting is right. It doesn't say anything about the behaviors you're implementing in there. And that's when the framework stop being a framework and start being a modeling approach. It's only when you start putting some assumptions behind the behaviors of different sectors or agents in the economy that you start from going only to an accounting framework to a modeling approach. So the equations can be divided in two parts. You have the accounting, the identities which are coming from the matrices you have. So you see basically that you're making sure that the sum across sectors across sectors and within a sector are coherent and consistent. But then you need to make some assumption on the behaviors. For example, how do you determine return earnings? Maybe you assume that it's a fixed share of the profits. How do you determine consumption? Maybe you assume that it's a propensity to consume out of income and out of wealth. And again here, that's where the economic work starts. Before that, it was just merely accounting. There is not much, it's a framework, it constrains you, but there is not much modeling techniques being used here. That's where the theory comes in, and that's where maybe you define yourself as a Caldorian, as a Straffian, or something else, okay? So you have now the idea of the SFC world, the accounting structure, and then the behavioral equations. And the behavioral equations will focus on certain assets or certain sectors. And you can see that the literature on stock-flow consistent has evolved quite a lot. This is from a paper of mine published in the CJE, and what we have been doing is tracking down the usage of the different, the modeling of the different assets. You see, so the darker the cell, the more the asset has been modeled in a paper. So the more papers are including that specific asset. And so you see that in 1995, not many assets being modeled. Bonds, equities, money, treasury bills. And as the modeling approach evolves and matures, you have more and more assets being included. And you see that after the crisis, there's been a lot of new assets being included and more paper being used. So you see that basically what's going on in the economy drives the inclusion of new assets, of new sectors. Okay, so now let's start doing something, because it's been nice, okay, I've been telling you these nice stories about the approach and so on and so forth, but how do you do a model? And this is the simplest model, is the chapter, I think, 3 from Godley and Lavoie, and it's the simplest model of an economy. So what are the different structure of the model? First of all, a few hypotheses. There is no private money, so it's only money being created by the government. There is no banks and no loans, so no interest payments. The economy is closed. It's a pure labor economy, no capital, so you only produce out of labor. There's no supply constraint of any kind, and there is no inventories. And finally, supply is always equal to demand, so there's a quantity adjustment mechanism, so you'll have inventories. No inventories. So the supply is fully adapting to demand. What are the sectors we're looking at? Households, producers, and government. Well, the households do what they do. They consume, they pay taxes, and they are being paid by wages, and they accumulate assets, which are going to be money. Producers are basically selling the services or goods to households and government, and they pay wages, and the government buys goods from firms, that's a government expenditure, and get taxes. And the only assets is cash, money, high-powered money. That's the matrix of the transaction flow matrix. So you have consumption, government expenditure, wage bill, taxes, which gives you the savings, and then you see how the savings are being allocated into the many different assets, basically money stock. And the balance sheet is very, very simple. All the wealth of the households is the net liabilities of the government. Okay, now the fun part is actually the behavioral equation. So we have that disposable income is equal to the wage bill, times employment, minus taxes. The tax is a fixed tax rate on the wage bill. The consumption function is a propensity to consume out of income, disposable income, plus a propensity to consume out of wealth. Bear in mind that this is not how you finance consumption. This is a propensity to consume. How you finance consumption is a different story. Then you have GDP being composed of consumption and government expenditure. And finally, employment is being determined by the nominal wage. So that's the behavioral part. That's the post-Keynesian, if you want, part of the model. And here you have only the accounting identities, making sure that supply is equal to demand. And then that you track down correctly the change in wealth. So the change in money supply by the government is equal to its deficit, and the change in money demand from the household part is equal to their savings, disposable income minus consumption. And here there's an important part of the post-Keynesian approach, which is the hidden equation. Because you have a system which is fully consistent and closed, the nth equation is implied by the remaining n minus 1s before. So the last equation is actually not needed. If the model is correctly specified, you always have that true. Okay? And that's a way to check that you're actually doing something right. If at some point you see that the money supply is different than money demand, that means something is leaking out of the economy and you don't have a Stock-Flow consistent model. Right. Now the numerical part. So what you have now is a bunch of equations, and you need to be able to simulate them. You want to be able to do that. So there's different ways to do it. People have done it in Excel, Mathematica, eViews. I am going to do a bit of self-promotion here. So with my colleagues in Limerick, we developed a package in R, which is open source, and I highly recommend it. It's very good to look at data and so on and so forth. And so the package has an internal parser. So what you need to do almost only to do is write down the equation in a text file, feed it up to the package. It will simulate out of this. For the moment, there's only one numerical solver, which is called the Gauss-Seidel algorithm, which is a bit twisted, but I won't go too much into details. I think one of the nice feature is that it allows for a graphical representation of the Stock-Flow consistent model by using direct acyclical graphs, and I'll show you in a bit what I mean by that. And there's plenty of tutorials, and you can download the package on the link here. And the tutorials actually, so R allows you to do these very nice tutorials where you actually can copy-paste the code. So what you'll do if you look at on GitHub, you'll see that you can basically copy-paste the source code into your RStudio and run the model and do all the different experiments we do there. So before actually showing you the results of the simulation, I wanted to do a quick example of how the model can give you some insight about why the post-Keynesian approach gives you some insight about what's going on in the economy. For example, here, let's assume, so we're looking at the consumption function, and we try to solve the system and try to see what is going to be the level of GDP. So, and if we assume that wealth is equal to 0 at first, so the consumption function simplifies to only a propensity to consume out of income, then you can feed that into GDP, and you have that GDP is equal to alpha 1, the propensity to consume out of income, times GDP times 1 minus theta plus G. And so you can solve that, and you get the value of GDP. And this thing here is the Keynesian multiplier. So any change in government expenditure will lead to a change in GDP, and by looking at this Keynesian multiplier. But that's the short-run Keynesian multiplier, because it depends on the value of h minus 1. Here we have assumed that h minus 1 was equal to 0, so this gives you the Keynesian multiplier in the short run. However, the economy will evolve. As consumption, if consumption is above income, then wealth will decrease. And because wealth decreases, the consumption function will decrease. And you eventually, at some point, reach a steady state. A situation where consumption, GDP, everything is stable. What is this case? Well, you can look at the long-run multiplier. Basically says when you are in a stable situation, consumption is equal to GDP, and wealth will be equal to whatever it is, so that this is true. So in this case, because consumption is equal to GDP, the function here changes. I'm going to move. Alpha 1 is disappearing, because you basically feed back, you replace consumption by disposable income, which is equal to this bit here. GDP times 1 minus theta. So the Keynesian multiplier in the long run simplifies quite a lot, because the alpha 1 here disappears, is equal to 1. So you have 1 minus 1 plus theta, which gives you y star is equal to g over theta. So it gives you a different steady state. So you understand the two notions. There's a short-run Keynesian multiplier, and there's a long-run Keynesian multiplier. On the short run, you will see that any increase in GDP will lead to an increase any increase in government expenditure will lead to an increase in GDP proportional to this Keynesian multiplier. On the long run, on the other hand, only the tax rate will play a role. So you see here how the post-Keynesian Stock-Flow consistent approach makes a strict distinction between the short run and the long run, and how the economy will adapt to any shock. So you can have the simulation results, and then, if you start from a situation where there's no net wealth, and you see the economy slowly evolving towards a steady state. What happens if we change a bit the model and we add expectations? I mean, we are in a situation of fundamental uncertainty, and your disposable income, we don't really know it. You can only guess it. So you now change the consumption function and include expected disposable income. And one way of modeling it is you just take the last period disposable income. But you could have something where you have adaptive, where you say, well, I know the economy is moving towards something, so I take into account the fact that there is a growing economy or a shrinking economy, so you actually have a more complicated expected disposable income. Okay? So what happens when you do this? Well, now, because households can make a mistake in expecting their disposable income, you need something to absorb these imbalances. You need something to absorb the fact that they might be wrong. And that thing that absorbs that is actually a stock. And in this case, there's only one stock, so it's cash. So what you see is that the supply of money is the same, G minus T. The demand for money is equal to the expected disposable income minus consumption, which they have decided. But the actual holding of money is equal to the disposable income minus consumption. So you can see that basically the difference between the holdings of cash and the demand for cash is equal to the difference between disposable income and expected disposable income. This highlights something very important as well, is that stocks are absorbing imbalances. Stocks are absorbing the mistakes or the errors that people are making when they do expectations. And that's why imbalances are so important. It's because these imbalances will then impact the stocks, and the stock will feed back afterwards. So if households are having less and less money, are less and less have less and less net worth, at some point their consumption behavior will change. And when that happens, you are in trouble. The reason why we have stagnation right now is because the households have been hit so badly, and you will see this with Till. So it's fundamental here. You see that the stocks are absorbing the imbalances that emerges out of the behavioral equations. That's the dark representation I was talking about. So you see that the SIM model has GDP fully adapting to any shock. There is a system of equation between GDP, employment, taxes, disposable income, and consumption, which feeds back. So any shock will be fully absorbed in this system. In the case of SIMEX, you don't have a system of equations. The system, because you're using expected disposable income, which is based on the past, won't absorb fully the shock. And so the stocks will be the one absorbing the shock. So, for example, if you have expected disposable income equal to the previous period, okay, the system somewhat goes back to the steady state we have seen before in the SIM model. Now, if you assume that the expected income is to a certain level, and they always make a mistake, what you see is that wealth is going to absorb that. So if, for example, households are always underestimating their disposable income, their consumption will be lower to what they should actually be doing, which means they'll be saving more and more. And that's when the wealth kicks back into the consumption function, because wealth is increasing through time. The propensity to consume out of wealth will make consumption increase up to the point when you reach, nonetheless, a steady state. This is the case where households are underestimating. What happens if households are overestimating? They are consuming more than what they should. Well, the net wealth is going down. That means more non-performing loans at some point, and that means that consumption will decrease quite a lot. Okay. 5 more minutes. Why do I think that all this is important? I mean, okay, this is fun. You've seen, it's really fun. Maybe you haven't seen, but anyway, trust me, it's fun. But I think that right now, we're not in a crisis. We are in a transition. The world which was prevailing before 2007 won't come back. I mean, the world is always changing. You have technological change, regulation change, climate change, anything. The world in which we lived before won't come back, and we are in a transition. The transition might be hurtful, and that's when Schumpeter comes in and says, well, you have creative destruction and obsolescence and so on and so forth, but the world in which we live is moving from one point to another point. So you need a model which allows you to understand this transition, because the speed at which the transition takes place, the direction of the transition, and so on and so forth, will shape the future of the economy. So in a world which is transiting, you cannot have a model which is based on equilibrium, because there is no one equilibrium. The equilibrium is always changing. So you need something which allows you to understand this transition, which is what drove the paper I wrote with two colleagues, Alessandro Caiani and Stefano Lucarelli. And we want to understand what happens when you have a fundamental change in the supply, in the capital stock. It's what Schumpeter called a technical revolution. So you have a new capital, let's say IT, for example, or the steam engine back in the days, which comes into play and will change dramatically the way in which the economy is structured. This is going to create massive tensions among the different sectors. Some sectors will disappear, some sectors will appear. And what is the connection with this structural change, the real dimension of it, and the financial world? I mean, obviously you see that if a sector is very productive, the financial world will be very interested and will invest more. And you might have a bubble. I mean, the dot-com bubble was clearly that. IT was clearly more performing. Everyone thought this was the brave new world. Let's go. Put some money in there. This creates a bubble. So the interactions between the real dimension and the real transition and the financial world is fundamental here. And you want to be able to understand these dynamics with something, with a model, which is what brought us to do this, the model. So we want to understand the interaction between real and financial dynamics to understand both short-term and long-term technological cycle. And we need to embed Minsky's, and remember Minsky was a student of Schumpeter, so his notion is still there. We need to embed Minsky financial instability hypothesis in a framework. So we tried to do this model, which was build a model of technological change with a Schumpeterian perspective, Schumpeterian/Minskian perspective, and we have a multi-sectoral model within a post-Keynesian Stock-Flow consistent model. So that's the model we are looking at. The interesting part happens here. So you have a traditional capital sectors, let's say, something old, and you have someone new, some new guy which says, I have a new capital stock, and it's being much more productive, and it's going to give you much more return. And then you have the consumption goods sector, which basically produces goods out of these two forms of capital, which sells the consumption goods to wage earners and to capitalists. These guys save to the bank, but also the capitalists invest in the stock market and buy shares of these three sectors. And then the banks is crediting, is providing loans to the different productive sectors. What do we see? The blue line is the consumption sector, the red line is the old traditional capital sector, and the green line is the new innovative sector. You clearly see there's a structural dynamics here, right? You see the old sector is disappearing and the new sector is appearing. This creates a boom and then a shock when this sector defaults. So you see there's a long-run dynamics. But you see on top of it, you have some short-term fluctuations. Where do they come from? These come from the financial sector. Basically, when the new sector enters the market, it needs credit creation. This credit creation to finance innovation and to finance the new capital stock is creating liquidity in the market. This liquidity in the market has to be allocated. And part of it goes to the financial market, which creates capital gains and creates fluctuations on the financial sector. That's how you start having this little wiggling here. At some point, the innovative sector decides to enter the financial market and offers new stocks. This creates a shifting of allocation of the assets of the capitalists between the two old equities and the new equities. At some point, this sector disappears. Huge non-performing loans, huge loss of values for those holding these equities. Again, massive shock. And you see that the shock here is much stronger than before. So what you see is that not only do you have a long-run dynamics coming out of the real structural dynamics, but you also have short-term fluctuations coming out of the financial instability due to the creation of this new sector. That's the market capitalization. You see that fluctuations happen not only in the two capital sectors, but also on the consumption sector shares. So it's very short, but what's the conclusion that we have seen? Well, you see that the model dynamics are driven by two fundamental processes. The replacement of the old obsolete capital by a new, more productive capital, long-term dynamic. And then the financial instability arising from the emergence of a new sector, short-term. So you see that you have feedbacks both from the real side when the new sector emerges and creates more profit, so from the real side to the financial world, but also from the financial world to the real side. If you have capital gains, household feels richer and they might decide to consume more. If you have capital loss, the other way around. So you have not only financial to real or real to financial. You have the two coming out all the way, and this is the complexity I was talking about. You want to understand what are these interactions happening in the economy. As I said, we are in a transition. And so to understand these different transitions, and I think there's, for the moment I see three, but maybe there's more, transition. Either you have technology-driven, I don't know, again, IT, what about nanotechnology, something like that. Technology-driven transition. You have regulation-driven. At some point, the government might decide, I don't want to invest in diesel cars. What happens when that happens? It's going to have some dynamics, some transition from one type of production to another one. And then you have the climate change, which the nature, if you want. If the world, because we live on Earth, is going to have some impacts, you need to have some transition as well. So transition happens all the time, and they might be big transitions or small transitions. These transitions, to understand them, you need a modeling framework which shows what? Endogenous cycles, explicit financial and real interactions, long run composed of short interactions and path dependency, and you need something which is multisectoral, because you need to have contagion effects. You want to see what happens in one sector, how this propagates to the rest of the economy. And usually the contagion effects goes through the financial sector. Okay, so I hope I convinced you. I hope you've seen that it's fun. So why should you use Post-Keynesian Stock-Flow consistent modeling? First of all, I strongly believe that you need to understand the balances or imbalances, both in stock and flow level. You want to understand what's going on there and what is going to be the impact of these imbalances on the stocks. One way to track that, looking at stock flow norms. Remember, a seemingly sound situation, 1999, Clinton was happy out. Might be hiding a more complicated situation and lead to an unsustainable situation. You need to understand the feedbacks between real and finance, and you need to have a dynamic model which shows path dependency. So the SFC framework, I believe, allows you to understand that. And because it's based on national accounts, it's actually fairly easy to build these indicators and to see how imbalances are building up. And the Post-Keynesian Stock-Flow consistent approach offers demand-driven models integrating finance and real side of the economy. I thank you for your attention. Feel free to send me any comments to my emails there, and there's a bunch of different websites you might find interesting. Thank you.